Hello and welcome everyone. So in this video we are going to understand the fourth chapter, encoding and evolution from data intensive applications. So let us first understand why encoding and evolution is important. Why do we need it? So we all understand that our applications, our systems evolve with time. That is, it changes with time. Why? Because of the new business requirements, new features gets added, user requirements changes, new product gets launched, new business circumstances comes. So our system has to evolve over the time. And in the first chapter we saw that our system should be evolvable so that it can easily adapt to the new changes. And as our application evolves with time, we might need to store new data, or we might need to store a data in a different format. And for this, we might have to add a new data type or modify the current data type in the DB. So in the second chapter, we also saw that various data models like relational models, NoSQL models, how they handle the changes in the schema. So relational model was a schema on write, whereas NoSQL was a schema on read. So in relational models, we have to conform to the one schema, but we can alter that schema at a later stages as per our need, whereas in NoSQL, we can store the multiple data formats at the same time. So how our application handles this change in schema? So on the server side applications, we have to do rolling upgrade, which means that some of the servers might hold the new applications, new version of application, whereas some servers might be running the old version of applications. So this is done to ensure that our new version runs smoothly and we do not get any errors. Whereas in client side applications, it totally depends on the user when he installs or upgrades the application. So that means that old and new versions of the code, also the old and new formats of the data, can coexist in our system at the same time. And for this we have to maintain the compatibility. So there are two compatibilities: backward compatibility and forward compatibility. So in backward compatibility, when the newer code can read the data that was written by the older code, that is, our older code writes some data, and when we deploy the newer version, that newer version of the code should be able to read the older format of the data. Whereas in forward compatibility, the older code should be able to understand what is written by the new code. So in cases, backward compatibility is easy to handle because newer code knows what was the format of the older code, but forward compatibility can be quite difficult to achieve because it is difficult to make older code understand that what was written by the new code. So in this chapter, we will see various encoding formats and how they are used for storage and communication. So before deep diving into various encoding and decoding formats, let us first understand what is encoding and decoding. So programmers usually work with data in at least two different representations. So the first one is in memory. So the data is kept in objects, structures, lists, arrays, etc. And these data structures are optimized for efficient access and manipulation by the CPU. And when you want to write data to a file or transfer over the network, you have to encode it as a self-contained sequence of bytes, because here the reference would not make any sense to the different process. Thus we need a translation layer between these two representations, that is, the translation from the in-memory representation to the byte sequence, which is called encoding or serialization or marshalling, and the reverse of it, that is, the translation from byte sequence to the in-memory representation, is called decoding, parsing, deserialization or unmarshalling. So now let us understand some examples of language specific formats and their problems. So many programming languages come with built-in support for encoding in memory objects into the byte of sequences. For example, Java has Java serializable, Ruby has Marshall, and Python has Pickle. So these encoding libraries are very convenient because they allow in-memory objects to be saved and restored with minimal additional code. But these libraries also come with additional problems. For example, the encoding is often tied to a particular programming language, and reading the data in another language is very difficult. So if we are storing or transmitting the data in such an encoding, we are committing ourselves to use that current programming language for a longer period of time. As well as there are security issues in these language specific formats. And for example, Java serializable is known for its bad performance and bloated encoding, so efficiency might also take a toll. So for these reasons, it is generally a bad idea to use the language specific format. And for this reason, we are going to see various other formats like JSON, XML and binary variants. So JSON and XML are widely known, widely supported and also widely disliked. For example, XML is known for being too verbose and unnecessarily complicated. And JSON got its popularity because of its built-in support in web browsers. CSV is also another popular language format, but it's less powerful. So JSON, XML and CSV are textual formats and thus somewhat human readable. But they also come with various problems. For example, there is a problem around the ambiguity of encoding of numbers. So in XML and CSV, we cannot distinguish between a number and a string, whereas in JSON, we cannot distinguish between an integers and floating point numbers, and it also doesn't let us specify a precision. So JSON and XML support the Unicode characters, but they cannot transfer binary strings, that is, they cannot transfer the sequence of bytes. So to overcome these limitations, people are using the encoding format, that is, they are encoding the binary strings into the base 64, but this increases the data size by 30%, 33%, and it makes the data bulky and hacky. Also, there is optional schema in JSON and XML. So applications that don't use XML and JSON schemas need to potentially hardcode the appropriate encoding and decoding logic. So CSV also does not have the schema. So it is up to the application to define the meaning of each row and column. If an application change adds a new row or column, you have to handle that change manually. So JSON is less verbose than XML, but both still use a lot of space compared to the binary formats. So this observation led to the development of binary encodings for JSON and XML. Like for JSON, we have MessagePack, BSON, BJSON, and for XML, other formats. So these formats have been adopted, but still they are not as widely adopted as the textual versions of JSONs and XMLs. So let us see some binary variants. So we all understand that JSON and XML are verbose and they take a lot of space than the binary encodings. So we saw some binary encodings for JSON like MessagePack, BSON, BJSON, and for XML like WBXML and FastInfoSet. So if we encode the given data in MessagePack, it takes 66 bytes, whereas we encode the same data in JSON, textual JSON encoding, it takes 81 bytes. So it is not clear that such a small space reduction is worth the loss of the human readability. So there comes other binary encoding libraries like Apache Thrift and protocol buffers, which takes less amount of size, around 32 bytes, to encode the same amount of data. So these various encoding formats like JSON, XML, CSV and binary encodings use different mechanisms to handle the changes in schema. So now we will see how these encoding formats are used to store and communicate the data across various processes and between different processes, like between databases, between service calls and between messaging passing, that is through asynchronous messaging. So now let's understand the data flow through databases. So in a database, the process that writes to the database encodes the data and the process that reads from the database decodes it. So in general, it's common for several different processes to be accessing a data at the same time. Those processes might be several different applications or services, or they might simply be several instances of the same service. So it is likely that some processes accessing the database will be running the newer code and some will be running the older code. So for example, because the new version is currently being deployed in a rolling upgrade, so some instances have been updated while others haven't. So we have to maintain the backward compatibility as well as the forward compatibility of the data. For example, if you decode a database value into model objects in the application and later re-encode those model objects, the unknown field might be lost in that translation process. So solving this is not a hard problem, but it's just that we need to be aware of it. So a database generally allows any value to be updated at any time. This means that within a single database, you may have some values that were written just 10 seconds ago and some values which were written 10 years ago. So when you deploy a new version of your application, you may entirely replace the old version with the new version within a few minutes or within a few seconds. But this is not true for database contents. The 5-year-old data or the 10-year-old data which is still there will be there, and it will be there in the original encoding format unless you write it with the new encoding format. So this observation is sometimes summed up as data outlives code. So rewriting or migrating the data into the new schema is certainly possible, but it's an expensive thing to do on a large data set, and so most of the databases avoid it if it is possible. So schema evolution thus allows the entire database to appear as if it was encoded with a single schema, even though the underlying storage may contain records encoded with various historical versions of the schema. So now let us see the data flow through services, that is REST and RPC. So when you have processes that need to communicate over a network, there are very different ways of arranging that communication. So the most common arrangement is to have two roles, that is client and server. So the server exposes an API over the network and the clients can connect to the servers to make that request to the API. So the API exposed by the server is also known as service. So the web works this way. Client makes a request to the web servers by making a GET request, POST request or PUT request. So the API consists of a standard set of protocols and data formats like HTTP, URLs, SSL, TLS, HTML, etc. Because these web browsers, web servers and website authors mostly agree on these standards. So moreover, a server can itself be a client to another service. For example, a typical web app server acts as a client to a database. This approach is often used to decompose a large application into smaller services by the area of functionality, such that when one service makes a request to another service, it requires some functionality or data from the other service. So this way of building applications that traditionally has been called a service-oriented architecture and now has been rebranded as microservices architecture. So key design goal of service-oriented microservices architecture is to make the application easier to change and maintain by making services independently deployable and evolvable. For example, each server should be owned by one team and the team should be able to release new versions of the service frequently without having to coordinate with the other teams. So in other words, we should expect old and new versions of the servers and the clients to be running at the same time. So the data encoding used by the servers and clients must be compatible across versions of the service API. So that is what we have been talking about in this chapter. So when HTTP is used as the underlying protocol for talking to the service, it is called a web service. So this is perhaps a slight misnomer because web services are not used only on the web but in several different contexts. For example, a client application can be running on a user's device. We might be running one service which is making a request to another service owned by the same organization, also known as middleware services, or one service making a request to service owned by the different organizations. So if we see, there are two approaches of web services, that is REST and SOAP. So now let us see and understand them. So REST is not a protocol rather than a design philosophy. It emphasizes on simple data formats. For example, it uses URL for identifying the resources and it uses HTTP features like cache control, authentication and content type negotiation. So an API designed according to the principles of REST is called RESTful API. Whereas SOAP is an XML based protocol for making the network API request. Although it is most commonly used over HTTP, but it aims to be independent from HTTP and avoids using most of the HTTP features. Instead, it comes with a complex multitude of related standards called Web Service Framework. So the API for SOAP web service is described using WSDL, that is Web Services Description Language. A WSDL is not designed to be human readable, and as SOAP messages are often too complex to construct manually, users of SOAP heavily rely on the tool support and code generation tools, whereas RESTful APIs tend to favor simple approaches, typically involving less code generation and automated tooling. Also, there are various open API formats like Swagger, which is used for documentation of RESTful APIs. So now let's see problems with RPC, that is remote procedure call. So an RPC model tries to make a request to the remote network service, and it looks like that it is calling a function or the method in the programming language within the same process. So this abstraction is called location transparency. Although RPC seems convenient at first, but this approach is fundamentally flawed because a network request is different from a local function call. A local function call is predictable, whereas a network request is totally unpredictable because the request or the response may be lost due to network problem, or the remote machine may be slow or unavailable, and such problems are totally entirely outside of our control. A local function call either returns a result or a response, or it never returns because it goes into the infinite loop. But network request has another possible outcome. It may return without a result due to a timeout. In that case, we simply don't know what happened. If we don't get a response from the remote service, we have no way of knowing whether the request got through or not. And if we retry a failed network request, it could happen that the request actually got through the first time and only the responses were getting lost, that is through timeout. In that case, retrying will cause the action to be performed multiple times unless we build a mechanism for deduplication, that is idempotency. Every time we call a local function, it normally takes the same amount of time, but a network request is much slower than a function call and its latency can be variable. And when we call a local function, it can efficiently pass a reference or a pointer to the objects in the local memory. So when we make a network request, all those parameters need to be encoded into a sequence of bytes that can be sent over the network. So all of these factors mean that there is no point trying to make a remote service look too much like a local object in your programming language because it's fundamentally different thing. So part of the appeal of REST is that it doesn't try to hide the fact that it's a network protocol. And even despite all these problems, RPC isn't going away. Various RPC frameworks have been built on top of the encodings mentioned in this chapter. For example, Thrift come with RPC support included. Also, gRPC is an RPC implementation using protocol buffers. So now we'll see how the data flows through the message passing. So we have been looking at the different ways encoded data flows from one process to another. So far we have discussed REST and RPC, where one process sends a request over the network to another process and expects a response as quickly as possible. And we have seen the databases where one process writes the encoded data and another process reads it. So here now we will discuss asynchronous message processing systems, which are somewhere between the RPC and databases. That is, they are similar to the RPC in that a client's request is delivered to another process with low latency, and they are similar to databases in that a message is not sent via a direct network connection but goes via an intermediary called a message broker, also called a message queue or a message oriented middleware, which stores the message temporarily. So there are various advantages of message broker as compared to the direct RPC. For example, it can act as a buffer if the recipient is unavailable or overloaded, and thus it improves the reliability. Also, it can automatically redeliver the messages to a process that has crashed and thus prevent messages from being lost. It also allows one message to be sent to several recipients, and it also logically decouples the sender from the recipient. That is, the sender just publishes the message and doesn't care who consumes them. So this communication pattern is asynchronous. That is, the sender doesn't wait for the message to be delivered but simply sends it and then forgets about it. So now let's summarize what we have studied in this chapter. We have looked at the importance of encoding and evolution. We have understood what is encoding and decoding. We have seen various encoding formats like JSON, XML, CSV, binary encodings, thrift and protocol buffers. Also, we have seen how these encoding formats are used to pass the data between various processes like databases, services and message passing. So I hope you liked the video. Thank you so much.